I never asked for this assignment. Let me be clear about that. When the high table of the Athrani Assembly handed me a posting slip that read, Sol System, Observation Unit 7, Duration, 6 cycles, I did not celebrate. I did not feel honored. I stood in the hallway outside the briefing chamber and stared at the slip for a long time, wondering what exactly I had done to deserve this. My name is Zel Vorath. I am a junior xenologist with the Third Conclave, which means I spend my life cataloging species that the senior researchers do not want to bother with. Usually that means slime colonies on methane rocks, or insect-tier hive minds that do nothing interesting except build the same hexagonal structures over and over for 10,000 years. It is not glamorous work, but it is safe. It is predictable. I understand it. Humans were supposed to be the same thing. That is what the file said. I read it 3 times on the transit pod from the assembly hub to the observation relay station. The file on humans was 47 pages long, which sounds impressive, until you realize that 30 of those pages were atmospheric data, geological surveys, and a detailed breakdown of their electromagnetic signal output. The actual section on the species itself was 9 pages. 9 pages for an entire civilization. The summary at the front said this: species designation, human. Planet, Earth. Third orbital body. Sol system. Classification. Provisional Class 2. Behavioral markers. Tribal social organization. Advanced tool use. Limited interplanetary capability. High intraspecies conflict rate. Threat assessment. Negligible. Observation priority. Low. Recommended action. Passive monitoring. No intervention required. Negligible. That was the word they used. I read it, thought nothing of it, and filed the information in the part of my memory reserved for routine assignments. My observation pod was a small, flattened disc, roughly the size of what humans would call a dining room table. It was cloaked, climate-controlled, and equipped with enough sensor equipment to scan a species down to the cellular level. It could hover silently at any altitude, match any terrain signature, and render itself invisible to every detection system humans had ever built. I had used pods like this for 11 years. I was comfortable in them. I parked above the northern region of a continent humans called Asia, specifically above a chain of mountains that translated roughly to the Great Spine of the World. It was winter. The mountains were covered in snow and silence, and for the first 2 days, nothing happened at all. I cataloged the wind patterns. I logged some bird behavior. I filed a preliminary report that contained the phrase, "Species appears consistent with Class 2 baseline profile," and settled in for what I expected to be a very long, very dull posting. On the 3rd day, the soldiers arrived. I picked them up on thermal scan first. 12 heat signatures moving in tight formation through a narrow valley approximately 4 kilometers below my position. They were moving fast and low, using the natural shape of the land to stay hidden. I zoomed the sensors in and got my first clear look at human soldiers in the field. They looked, frankly, unremarkable. 2 legs, 2 arms, upright posture. They wore layered material over their bodies against the cold, and they carried equipment on their backs and in their hands. The equipment included what my database identified as projectile propulsion devices, firearms, in the human vernacular, and a variety of electronic components I flagged for later analysis. They moved in a pattern that showed some degree of training and coordination, but nothing that struck me as exceptional. I cross-referenced the visual data with the intelligence fragment the Conclave had given me about current regional conflicts in this area. These 12 appeared to belong to a unit from a country called the United Kingdom, operating in a disputed mountain corridor. Their mission parameters, as best as I could reconstruct from intercepted communication fragments, involved reaching a specific location approximately 12 kilometers north. They were not going to reach it, because behind them, already spreading through 3 separate approach routes that fed into this valley, came the second group. I detected them on the perimeter sensors before the humans below did. 340 soldiers, moving in a coordinated encirclement pattern that I recognized immediately from the tactical studies included in the Conclave's Class 2 behavioral database. It was a classic containment maneuver. 1 group drives the target forward. 3 others converge to seal every exit. By the time the prey realizes the net is closing, it is already closed. I ran the numbers without much thought, the way I always did at the start of an observation sequence. 12 against 340. The terrain favored the larger force. The valley narrowed as it ran north, which meant the 12 soldiers had nowhere to go except forward into a closing gap, or backward into the force that had driven them here. Their communication equipment was being jammed. I could see the interference pattern in their signal output. They could not call for help. The weather was deteriorating, which grounded any aerial support. By every metric in the Conclave's tactical assessment framework for Class 2 species, this was a finished calculation. I opened a new observation log on my data terminal and labeled it Intraspecies Conflict, Valley Engagement, Northern Mountain Corridor. I set the recording sensors to standard capture mode. I poured myself a container of heated nutrient broth, because it was cold even inside the pod, and I settled back to observe what I fully expected would be either a swift end or a swift surrender. Then one of the 12 soldiers stopped walking, turned around, and looked directly at the ridge above the southern approach. He could not see me. I was certain of that. My cloaking was functioning perfectly, and even if it had not been, I was well beyond human visual range. He was not looking at me. He was looking at the terrain. His name, as I later learned from captured communication fragments, was Corporal Owen Hart. He was 26 years old, and he had grown up in a city called Manchester, and by every biological metric I had on record, he should have been terrified. His body was producing stress hormones at elevated levels. His heart rate was elevated. The micro-tremors in his hands were consistent with a fear response. But his face was completely still. He stood there for perhaps 4 seconds, scanning the ridge above the southern approach. Then he turned to the soldier nearest him, a woman whose name I later identified as Sergeant K. Brennan, and he said 6 words. My translation algorithm caught them clearly. He said, "They're already behind us, Kay." She did not react the way my behavioral models predicted. She did not show signs of panic. She did not freeze. She looked at him for 1 second, then looked at the valley walls around them, then nodded once, slowly, as if he had told her something she already suspected. "Then we stop running," she said. I set down my nutrient broth. I looked at my observation log. I looked at the encirclement data on my sensor display, at the 340 signatures tightening their net around this narrow valley. I looked at the 12 humans standing in the snow below, and I felt something shift in my chest that I did not immediately have a name for. I opened the log entry I had already started, and paused with my notation tool hovering over the text. After a moment, I deleted the label I had written. I replaced it with a question. I wrote, "Why are they not running?" Then I watched Sergeant K. Brennan gather the other 10 soldiers around her in the shadow of a boulder, pull out a handheld electronic device, and begin to draw lines on it with her finger. The others leaned in close. Nobody panicked. Nobody argued. Nobody looked at the mountains around them with the wide, unfocused eyes of a creature that has given up. They looked like people solving a problem. I increased the sensor resolution to maximum. I told myself it was standard procedure. I told myself this was nothing unusual, that Class 2 species occasionally displayed unexpected behavioral variants, and that I would file a thorough note in the appendix of my routine report. I did not believe myself. The encircling force was perhaps 2 hours from completing its cordon. The 12 humans had perhaps 90 minutes before every exit from this valley was sealed. They spent the first 10 of those minutes huddled around Sergeant Brennan's device. Then they picked up their equipment, and they spread out across the valley floor, moving with quiet, deliberate purpose in the fading afternoon light. Not toward any exit, not toward any escape route. They spread out, and they began to dig. I stared at my sensor display for a long time. I stared at 12 humans digging into frozen mountain soil in the middle of a tactical encirclement, with over 300 soldiers closing in from every direction. I opened my log again. I wrote, "Revising preliminary assessment. Behavior does not match Class 2 baseline profile. Possible displacement activity under terminal stress. Inserting subsection for anomalous response patterns." Then I sat back and I watched them work, and the feeling in my chest that I did not have a name for got a little bit larger. Outside, the sun was going down. The temperature dropped another 4 degrees. The snow began to fall again, covering the valley floor in white silence. The 12 humans kept digging, and they did not stop. The encircling force set their perimeter at nightfall. I tracked all 340 of them through the darkness on thermal imaging. They positioned themselves in rings across every approach route, every ridgeline, every gap in the valley walls that could serve as an exit. They did it with the calm efficiency of soldiers who had done this many times before, and who understood exactly what the numbers meant. 340 to 12. A ratio so overwhelming that the math barely needed doing. They set their watches, they established their communication network, they confirmed their positions, and then most of them settled in to wait for morning. Their field commander, a man I identified from intercepted communications as a major, named in the transmissions only as Goran, sent one message to his superior, at 2100 hours local time. My translation algorithm rendered it as follows. Target unit contained. Valley sealed on all approaches. Awaiting dawn to advance. Expect resolution within 1 hour of first light. I logged the message. Then I turned my sensors back to the 12 humans at the center of the net. They were not sleeping. They had divided into 3 rotating groups. While 4 of them dug, 3 monitored the perimeter with handheld detection equipment, and 5 worked on something I could not immediately identify at the northern end of the valley. I brought the sensors in closer and increased the resolution until I could see individual hand movements, and even then it took me several minutes to understand what I was looking at. They were building something, or more precisely, they were installing something, running thin cables through the soil, carefully, precisely, following a pattern that someone had clearly planned out in advance. The cables connected to small devices, which they buried at intervals and then covered with snow and loose rock so carefully that even my high-resolution thermal scan struggled to distinguish them from the natural terrain. I cross-referenced the device signatures against the Conclave's database of human military technology. The database returned a classification. I read it twice. Then I sat very still for a moment. They were not digging defensive positions. They were mining the valley. Not with the crude pressure plate devices I had seen in historical records of earlier human conflicts. These were something more sophisticated. Linked detonation systems, placed at specific geometric intervals, connected by a network of thin wire that I now realized ran beneath the entire valley floor like a web. The placement was not random. Someone had looked at this terrain and calculated exactly where a large force would have to walk to advance into the valley, and exactly where the natural shape of the land would funnel that force, and exactly where to place each device to achieve maximum effect within that funnel. I pulled up the tactical assessment framework in the Conclave database. I ran the placement pattern through the analysis algorithm. The algorithm told me the placement was optimal, not approximate, not close, optimal, to within a margin of error of less than 2%. 12 soldiers had looked at a mountain valley in the dark, with a force of 340 closing in around them, and had designed a tactical installation that an Ithrani military analysis computer called optimal. I did not know what to do with that information, so I set it aside and kept watching. At midnight, Sergeant K. Brennan did something that stopped me completely. She sat down on a rock near the center of the valley, away from the others, and she took off one of her gloves and pressed her bare hand against the snow on the ground beside her. She held it there for perhaps 30 seconds. I had my biosensors locked on her, so I had her complete physiological profile in real time. Heart rate, elevated but steady. Cortisol levels, high. Muscle tension, reduced from the earlier peak. Brainwave pattern. I checked the database and found the closest match was labeled meditative state. She was sitting in the middle of a trap she had just helped build, surrounded by 340 enemy soldiers, in below freezing temperatures, in the dark. And she was calm. I wrote in my log, Human Brennan displays physiological markers inconsistent with expected stress response. Query, is this individual an outlier or representative of group baseline? Then I scanned the other 11. One of them, a young soldier I had tagged as Human Heart, was doing something with his hands that I eventually recognized as a manual dexterity exercise, moving his fingers through a repeating pattern. Another, a tall man with a shaved head I came to think of as Human Cole, was lying on his back looking at the sky, completely still, his breathing slow and regular. They were afraid. My biosensors confirmed that clearly. Every one of them was producing fear markers. But the fear was not controlling them. It was present in their bodies, and apparently absent from their behavior, as if they had learned to hold those two things in separate rooms and close the door between them. I had studied 57 species in my career. I had never seen that before. At 0200 hours, Corporal Owen Hart moved to the eastern slope of the valley and began work on a secondary cable run. He worked without a light source, navigating by touch and memory in almost total darkness, and the placement he achieved was, when I analyzed it later, perfectly consistent with the overall grid pattern. He had memorized his section of the plan and was executing it blind, in the cold, without hesitation. At 3330 hours, Sergeant Brennan conducted a quiet check of every installation point, verifying each connection in sequence. I followed her on the thermal scan. She found 2 connections that were not fully secure, corrected them without comment, and moved on. At 400 hours, they ate cold rations from their packs, eaten in silence, quickly. Then they moved to their assigned positions and they waited. The encircling force outside the valley slept in shifts, confident and comfortable. Their commander's last log entry before sleep was a single line: "Will confirm resolution by 0900. I looked at my own notes. I had now filled more observation log pages in 12 hours than I typically filled in an entire 3-week posting. I had flagged 11 behavioral anomalies. I had revised my preliminary assessment 4 times. I looked at the valley below, at the snow-covered ground that looked completely undisturbed, at 12 human soldiers lying still in the dark, waiting. At 0515 hours, the sky began to pale at its edges. Not full light yet, just the faint suggestion of it, the first gray hint of a winter dawn. I watched the encircling force begin to stir, watched them check their equipment, coordinate their positions, tighten the final gaps in their cordon. They were professionals and they moved well. By 0540 they were advancing. 340 soldiers walked into the valley from 3 directions simultaneously, moving in coordinated columns, exactly as Sergeant Brennan had known they would. They took the natural approach routes, because those were the easiest paths through the terrain. They filled the gaps in the channels and the natural corridors through the rock, because those were the only ways to move a large force through a mountain valley in winter. They walked across the snow that looked completely undisturbed. The snow that held, beneath it, a grid of precisely placed, optimally positioned, fully connected devices that 12 exhausted, outnumbered, surrounded human soldiers had installed in the dark. By 0548, the entire forward element of the encircling force was inside the valley. By 0550, the follow-up columns had filled the approach corridors. By 0552, Sergeant K. Brennan, lying in a shallow position at the northern end of the valley, had a clear line of sight to the detonation unit in her left hand, and 340 enemy soldiers spread across the ground in front of her. She did not hurry. She waited until the last column closed the last gap. She waited until they were all in. Then she pressed the switch. The ridgelines answered her. Both of them. All at once. I had my sensors at maximum resolution, and I still struggled to process what happened in the next 4 seconds. The valley did not just shake. It restructured itself. Every carefully calculated placement point discharged in the sequence Brennan's team had designed, and the effect moved through the terrain in a wave that collapsed approach routes, sealed exit corridors, and transformed the confined valley floor into a space of total chaos, in less time than it takes to say the words. My sensors recorded the sound at a level that exceeded my equipment's measurement ceiling. I had to reduce sensor sensitivity by 60% to maintain clean data capture. I looked at my tactical assessment framework. I looked at the numbers I had run 12 hours earlier, 12 against 340. Ratio so overwhelming the math barely needed doing. I looked at what was happening below me. I ran the numbers again. My algorithm returned an error message. The error message said, in the dry language of Conclave software, input parameters conflict with established model. Please verify data. My data was verified. My input parameters were correct. The model was wrong. And then, before I had fully processed what I had just watched, the 12 humans moved. They came out of their positions, and they advanced into the confusion below. And what happened next, I am going to try to describe accurately. Because it is important that I describe it accurately, and I am going to need a moment before I do that. I have seen violence before, in my years of observation work. I have catalogued predator-prey interactions on 6 worlds. I have observed intraspecies conflict among Class 2 and Class 3 species on 4 others. I understand the mechanics of it. I can observe it and document it and process it without difficulty, as a professional scientist who has been doing this work for a long time. What happened in that valley in the next 9 minutes was not like any of those things. It was not chaotic. That is the first thing I need to say. The chaos was in the 340. The 12 were not chaotic at all. They moved through the disorder below them in a geometric pattern, each one occupying a specific lane, each one advancing at a specific angle, the whole thing fitting together like the teeth of a machine. And at the center of it, standing at a slight rise in the valley floor where she could see the entire space, Sergeant K. Brennan directed it with a voice so quiet that I had to push my audio sensors to maximum to catch the words. She did not shout. She did not need to shout. Every one of the 11 people she was directing had their communication receivers on. She spoke in a low, steady tone, and they responded to it the way parts of a clock respond to the mechanism at their center. A word here, a direction there, a name, a location, a confirmation. Her heart rate, at the moment she pressed the detonation switch, had been lower than it was when I observed her sleeping 2 nights before. I sat in my pod, and I watched the 9 minutes pass, and I did not make a single note the entire time. When it was over, I sat in silence for a long while. Then I very carefully opened my observation log, went back to the preliminary entry I had written on day 1, and I deleted everything I had written except for the heading. Beneath the heading, I typed 1 sentence. I need to start this report again from the beginning. Then I added a 2nd sentence. I also need to contact the conclave, and I need to do it before I file anything, because what I have just observed is not something that should sit in a standard observation queue. Outside, the snow was falling again, gently, covering the valley floor in clean white. From my altitude, if you did not look too closely, it almost looked peaceful. I looked at my communications terminal. I looked at the priority flags listed in the conclave's transmission protocol. There were 5 priority levels. Level 5 was routine. Level 1 was reserved for events that presented a potential systemic concern to the assembly. I had used Level 1 exactly once in 11 years, and that was a clerical error. I set this transmission to Level 1. Then I held my notation tool over the message field for a long moment, trying to find the right words. I have a postgraduate degree in xenolinguistics. I have written thousands of scientific documents. I am, by any professional measure, a competent communicator. I could not find the words for what I had just watched. I finally typed, requesting immediate advisory consultation. Human species assessment requires urgent revision. Observed field behavior in high-pressure conflict scenario does not match Class 2 profile. Does not match any profile in current database. Please advise on classification protocol. Standing by. I sent it. Then I turned back to my sensor display, and I watched the 12 humans gather together in the quiet valley below, and I pulled up every piece of historical data the conclave had ever collected on this species, and I began to read. I read for a very long time. By the time the conclave responded to my message, I had read enough to understand that what I had watched this morning was not an exception. It was not a fluke. It was not a variance. It was not an outlier. It was just Tuesday. My reading started with the military history files, and then expanded outward until I was pulling everything the conclave had ever collected on humans, going all the way back to the earliest observation records from 300 years ago, when the assembly first detected their electromagnetic signals leaking out into space and sent an initial probe to take a look. The initial probe report was 4 pages long and described humans as a promising but self-limiting species, likely to resolve their primary threat of intraspecies conflict through either cultural evolution or self-destruction within the next 200 years. That report was 300 years old. The conflict was still ongoing. I read the historical files that followed, decade by decade, century by century. I moved through the archive of everything the assembly had gathered about how humans had spent their time on their planet. And the more I read, the more the comfortable categories I had used to organize my understanding of them stopped fitting. The Class II classification system was built on a simple framework. A Class II species uses tools, organizes in social groups, engages in intra-species competition, and has not yet achieved interstellar capability. Within that framework, there was an assumed arc. Species start at the lower end. Small groups, simple weapons, limited coordination. Over time, if they survive, they develop more complex social structures, more sophisticated conflict resolution mechanisms, and the conflicts themselves become less frequent and less costly as the species matures. That is the normal arc. That is what the data from 41 other Class II species showed. Humans did not follow that arc. Humans had started with small groups, simple weapons, and limited coordination approximately 10,000 years ago by their calendar. 10,000 years later, the groups were larger. The weapons were sophisticated beyond anything any other Class II species had ever independently developed, and the coordination, as I had just watched in a mountain valley, was something that my conclave analysis software had called optimal. The conflicts had not become less frequent. They had not become less costly. They had become more frequent, and the cost had risen consistently with every passing century. And humans had kept going, kept adapting, kept refining, as if each conflict was not a tragedy to be avoided, but a problem to be solved, and an experience to be learned from. There was a human word that I found in the linguistic files and had to look up several times before I felt I understood it properly. The word was veteran. It described a person who had survived conflict and carried the knowledge of that survival forward. Every other Class II species I had studied treated veterans as damaged, beings marked by trauma, to be healed if possible, and otherwise set aside. Humans treated their veterans as a resource. They gave them authority. They gave them responsibility. They built institutions specifically to extract and preserve what their veterans knew, and then they used that knowledge to train the next generation before conflict arrived. They were the only species in the Conclave database that institutionalized the transfer of conflict knowledge across generations. I sat with that fact for a long time. If you fight once, you learn something about fighting. If you survive to fight again, you know more. If you survive long enough to teach others, and they survive to teach others, and that chain continues for 10,000 years without a break, what do you get? I looked at the valley below, at 12 humans who had, in one night, designed and installed a tactical system that my analysis algorithm had rated optimal. I thought I was starting to understand what you get. There was a section in the archive on human military academies, institutions whose sole purpose was the formal study of conflict, not the manufacture of weapons, not the organization of armies, but the pure intellectual study of how conflict works. Humans sent their brightest young people to spend years at these institutions, learning the history, the theory, the mathematics, the psychology, and the engineering of organized confrontation. They produced, through these institutions, people who understood conflict the way Ethrani scientists understood atmospheric chemistry or stellar mechanics, systematically, comprehensively, with a depth of accumulated knowledge that had been building for 10,000 years. No other species in the database had anything like this. Most species had military organizations, yes, but they were practical institutions. They trained soldiers. Human military academies trained thinkers who thought specifically and exclusively about conflict, and then those thinkers trained soldiers, and then those soldiers went to places like this mountain valley. I pulled up the profile on Sergeant K. Brennan, assembled from communications intercepts, personnel records that had leaked through their imperfect signal encryption, and the Conclave's previous observation files on British military units in this region. She was 31 years old. She had entered military service at 17. She had spent 14 years in the field and in further training institutions, with service in 4 separate conflict zones on 3 continents. Every conflict she had survived had, according to her personnel file, been followed by a formal debrief process in which she had documented what she had learned. Those documents were shared with her unit, her commanders, and the institutional knowledge system her military maintained. She had been learning to do exactly what I watched her do this morning for 14 years. And she was good at it the way a scientist is good at science, not just through practice, but through understanding. I had translated enough of her communications to know that she did not just act correctly in the valley. She knew why each action was correct. She could have explained the geometry of the installation grid, the logic of waiting until all columns were inside, the value of the quiet command voice over shouting. She knew these things in the way that you know things when you have studied them, not just done them. I found a fragment in the archive from a lecture given at one of their military academies. I do not know the speaker's name, but the fragment said, "The soldier who understands why they are doing something will always outperform the soldier who has only been told what to do. Because when the situation changes, and the situation always changes, the soldier who understands can adapt, and the soldier who was only told will freeze." I sat back and I thought about Owen Harday, at 0200 hours, running cable in total darkness, navigating by memory, placing his section of the installation grid without a light source, and without supervision, because he understood the plan well enough to execute his piece of it alone. The situation had changed. Darkness, no supervision, freezing temperatures, and he had not frozen. He had adapted. I spent another 3 hours in the archive, and I found more things that I did not know what to do with. I found records of previous conflicts where small human units had defeated much larger ones, and I found that these events were common enough in human military history that they had their own terminology. Humans called it asymmetric engagement, and they had written entire books about it, entire libraries of analysis on how it worked and why and when, and those libraries were available to any soldier who wanted to read them. I found records of human units that had been captured and held for years, and had survived those years through what could only be described as a collective, organized psychological resistance program, where captured soldiers coached each other in techniques for maintaining mental stability under prolonged stress. They had developed these techniques not once but repeatedly, independently, across different cultures and different centuries, as if the knowledge kept being rediscovered, because it kept being needed. I found a study in the archive conducted by a research group at one of their medical universities, analyzing the neurological profiles of experienced soldiers under high-stress conditions. The study described a phenomenon where, in individuals with extensive conflict experience, the brain's fear processing center and its decision-making center appeared to become more tightly integrated over time, so that fear, instead of interrupting decision-making, actually sharpened it. The authors described this as an adaptive response to prolonged environmental stress. The fear sharpened the decisions. I read that sentence 3 times. Every other species in the conclave database had a fear response that interrupted higher cognitive function. That was the universal model. Fear caused cognitive load, which reduced processing efficiency, which impaired decision-making. That was the baseline. That was what the model said should happen. For experienced human soldiers, fear did not reduce processing efficiency, it increased it. I thought about Sergeant Brennan's biosensor profile. Her heart rate elevated, her cortisol high, her body clearly in a fear state, her voice, when she spoke in the valley, the calmest and steadiest thing in the entire engagement. I opened my observation log and I wrote, "Preliminary classification of negligible threat in existing conclave file is not supported by observed data. Recommend immediate formal review of human species threat classification. Recommend suspension of passive monitoring only. Protocol pending outcome of review." Then I paused. Then I kept writing. Additional note, for the record, I have observed 57 species in 11 years of xenological fieldwork. In that time I have documented 1 example of genuinely surprising predatory adaptation, 2 examples of unexpected technological development, and 4 examples of behavioral patterns that required significant revision of existing models. I have never, until today, observed a species that required me to revise not just the model, but the entire framework the model was built on. I am noting this because I think it is important that whoever reviews this log understands that I am not reporting an anomaly. I am reporting the baseline. What I observed today was not unusual for this species. It was, as far as I can determine, normal. I sent the updated log to the Conclave archive. Then I went back to reading the human history files, because I was not done, and because I had the feeling, the growing, uncomfortable, honest feeling, that I was not going to be done for a very long time. The Conclave's response arrived 4 hours later. It came from an administrative assistant at the 3rd Conclave office, and it said, "Thank you for your field update. Your observations have been logged. Please continue monitoring per standard protocol and submit your formal report at the end of your posting cycle." I stared at that message for a long time. Then I sent back a single reply. I wrote, "With respect, I do not think you understood my previous message. I am going to send it again, and I am going to ask that it be forwarded to someone with authority to act on it. Because the species we have been calling negligible is not negligible. They have spent 10,000 years learning to do what I watch them do today, and they are still learning. And at some point, not this year, perhaps not this century, but at some point, they are going to look outward. And when that day comes, I do not want the conclave to still have this species classified as low priority. I want us to be ready. Please forward this message. Please read it carefully first." I sent it. Then, I sat in the quiet of my pod, and I listened to the wind outside, and I thought about the word veteran, and the word optimal, and the sentence about fear sharpening the decisions, and I thought about a mountain valley in winter, and 12 humans who had looked at an impossible situation and had not seen it as a defeat. They had seen it as a problem, and they had solved it. The conclave did not respond to my second message for 3 days. 3 days. I checked the transmission log 17 times in those 72 hours. The message had been received. The delivery confirmation came back within minutes. Someone, somewhere in the assembly hub, had received my message, read it, and chosen not to respond for 3 days. During those 3 days, I stayed in my pod above the valley, and I watched the 12 humans. I am going to be precise about why I continued watching them, because I want this record to be honest. I told myself it was professional obligation, that an ongoing observation posting required continuous monitoring of the subject unit. That was true, and it was also not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I could not stop watching them, because every time I looked away and then looked back, something had shifted in how I understood what I was seeing, and I needed to keep looking until I could hold the full picture in my mind at once. The days after the engagement in the valley were not dramatic. There were no further conflicts. The surviving members of the encircling force had largely dispersed into the mountains, and the 12 humans were waiting in a secured position for extraction. What they did during those 3 days was, by any surface reading, ordinary. They ate their rations. They slept in shifts. They maintained their equipment. They talked to each other. One of them, a young soldier I had identified as Private George Aldridge, read from a small physical book that he carried in the front pocket of his jacket. Another, the tall bald man I had been thinking of as Cole, his full name, it turned out, was Sergeant First Class Daniel Cole, spent his rest periods doing slow, controlled exercises, despite an injury he had sustained to his left shoulder during the engagement. Kay Brennan wrote in a small notebook, longhand, page after page, and when I managed to orient a camera at the right angle to read it, I found she was writing a detailed account of every decision made in the engagement. Not for official purposes. For herself. She was debriefing herself. Before anyone told her to. Before she was home. Before she was safe. Before the proper institutional process required it. She was sitting in a cold mountain position with an injury to her left hand that she had wrapped herself without comment, and she was writing down everything she had done, and why, and what she would do differently, and what had worked, and why it had worked, because she understood that the gap between an engagement and the formal debrief was a gap in which memory degraded, and she was not willing to lose the data. She was learning from it, in real time, while it was still happening. I wrote in my log, "Human Brennan post-engagement behavior shows active, self-directed knowledge extraction. No external prompt required. Duration, approximately 90 minutes of writing over 3 days. Content, tactical analysis, decision review, outcome assessment. This appears to be individual standard practice, not exceptional behavior." I flagged that last sentence and wrote it again in a separate note that I tagged as priority. This appears to be individual standard practice, not exceptional behavior. Not exceptional. That was the word I kept coming back to. I was watching people behave in ways that my training and 11 years of field experience told me were extraordinary, and those people were treating it as ordinary. They were not marveling at themselves. They were not aware that what they did was anything other than what people in their position did. It was as natural to Kay Brennan to sit and debrief herself in a cold mountain position as it was to eat her rations or clean her equipment. Because it was exactly as natural. It was trained behavior that had become reflex, and it had become reflex because she had been doing it for 14 years, in a system that had been doing it for much longer than that. On the second day, Corporal Hart did something that I watched for a long time without quite understanding. He took a younger soldier in the unit, a woman who I had not catalogued individually before, whose name turned out to be Private Lucy Farr, and he spent 2 hours walking her through the installation grid they had laid, not reviewing what had already happened, teaching. He walked her through the geometry, the logic, the placement decisions, why each point was where it was. She asked questions. He answered them. At the end, she took out her own small notebook and wrote for 15 minutes while he watched. He was training her, in the field, in a secured position after a completed engagement, passing the knowledge forward. I sat in my pod and I looked at this and I thought about the word veteran again, and I thought about the lecture fragment I had read about the soldier who understands always outperforming the soldier who was only told. Owen Hart was 26 years old, and he was already doing exactly what that lecture described, not because someone had told him to, but because he had been in a system long enough that it had become how he naturally thought about things. The knowledge transfer was not an institutional action, it was a personal reflex. I thought about what that meant, if you scaled it. 12 people in a valley, all doing this. A unit of 40, all doing this. An army, all doing this, for 10,000 years, each generation more capable than the last, not just because they had better equipment, but because they had more knowledge, and the knowledge compounded. I thought about compound interest, which is a concept I had learned about in the human economics files. Humans understood the extraordinary power of small gains that multiply over time. They called it one of the most powerful forces in their financial systems. They had been applying that principle to conflict knowledge for 10,000 years. I was still sitting with that thought when the conclave finally responded. The response came from someone I had not heard from before, a name I recognized from the assembly directory as belonging to a mid-level administrator in the Review and Classification Office, a branch that handled exactly the kind of species assessment updates I had been requesting. The message was longer than the first one, which I took as a mildly hopeful sign. It said, "Your field reports have been reviewed by the relevant office. The behavioral observations you have described are noted and will be incorporated into the periodic species profile updates scheduled for the next classification review cycle. Current classification of human species as Provisional Class 2 will be maintained pending that review. Your recommendation regarding priority flag revision has been passed to the appropriate review board. No immediate action is anticipated. Please continue your observation posting per standard protocol." I read it twice. Then I read it a third time, more slowly, paying attention to each specific phrase. Periodic species profile update. That was a process that ran every 50 years by assembly standard. 50 years. Half a century. In 50 years, based on the development rates I had been reading about in the historical archives, humans would have refined their capabilities in ways that I currently did not have models to predict. In 50 years, they might have active interplanetary presence. In 50 years, they might have encountered one of the assembly's outer system installations. In 50 years, the question would not be how to classify them. The question would be how to introduce ourselves without this going badly wrong. No immediate action is anticipated. I set the message down. I thought about what it would mean for the conclave to encounter humans for the first time unprepared. To have spent 50 years treating them as low priority, passive monitoring only, check back in half a century, to meet them in whatever state they were in by then, with no understanding of their history, no framework for their psychology, no sense of what they had learned and refined and become. I thought about an encircling force of 340 professional soldiers, confident and comfortable, settling in for the night around a valley they had sealed. I thought about a conclave assembly of 31 worlds, vast and ancient and very, very confident. I thought about what the ground looks like when you stop looking at it carefully. I opened a new document on my terminal, not an observation log, not a formal field report. Something else, something that I had never written before in 11 years of this work. and that I was writing now because I did not know what else to do. I called it an honest assessment. It was not addressed to the conclave. It was not addressed to the review and classification office. It was addressed to whoever, at some future date, might read my files and wonder if I had understood what I was looking at. I wrote, "If you are reading this, it is because the human species assessment eventually reached someone who wanted to understand the history of how the assembly perceived them. I want that history to be accurate. I wanted to record that at this date, at this time, a junior xenologist named Zel Vorath filed urgent reports that were received, and acknowledged, and not acted on. I wanted to record what I observed, and what I concluded from those observations. I wanted to record my conclusion clearly, without qualification or scientific hedging, because I think clarity matters here." I paused. Then I wrote the conclusion. Humans are the most conflict-adapted species I have ever observed, by a significant margin. They have been at war with themselves for 10,000 years, and it has not weakened them. It has built them. Every conflict they have survived has taught them something, and they have kept what they learned, and added it to the next generation, and the generation after that, and for 10,000 years this has been compounding. The individual humans I observed were not superhuman. They were frightened, and they were tired, and they were cold, and they operated through all of that with a precision and an effectiveness that my analysis systems did not have a category for. They are not special cases. They are the standard. I stopped. I looked at what I had written. Then I kept going. I do not know when humans will achieve interstellar capability. I do not know how long it will be before they look outward, but I know what they will bring with them when they do. They will bring 10,000 years of accumulated knowledge about how to function in the most difficult conditions their world has ever put them in. They will bring institutions specifically designed to learn from failure and pass that learning forward. They will bring individuals who have been shaped by those institutions to think clearly under pressure, adapt when conditions change, and teach what they know to the person next to them before anything has even finished happening. I took a long breath. I thought carefully about the next sentence. Then I wrote it. The Assembly has never fought a real war. The last armed conflict in Ithrani history was resolved 800 years ago. I am not saying this to alarm anyone. I am saying this because it is relevant context for what I am about to say, which is this. When humans eventually find us, they will be very good at something we have not practiced in 8 centuries. I do not know if that will matter. I hope it will not matter. But I think the honest, responsible, professional position is to stop treating them as low priority and start treating them as something we need to understand carefully, respectfully, and soon. I finished writing. I read it back. I saved it to the private section of my field archive, which would eventually be transferred to the Conclave record repository when my posting ended. Then I did one more thing. I went back to my sensor display, and I looked at the valley below, and I found Kay Brennan sitting on the same rock where I had first watched her hold her bare hand in the snow. It was evening now, cold and quiet, and she was looking at the mountains around her with an expression I had spent 3 days trying to classify. She was not afraid. She was not satisfied exactly. She was something more complex than either of those. I queried my xenolinguistics database for the closest match to the expression pattern I was seeing. The algorithm returned a suggestion. The human word it offered was ready. She looked ready. For what, I did not know. For the next thing, whatever it was. The next day, a transport aircraft arrived and collected all 12 of them. I watched it descend into the valley, watched them board in single file, efficient and orderly. Before she climbed in, Kay Brennan turned and looked at the valley once more. A long, scanning look, taking in the terrain, learning it, even now, even as she was leaving. Then she turned and stepped inside, and the aircraft lifted away, and the valley was empty and quiet, and I was alone above it in my little pod with my observation logs, and my unanswered questions, and my honest assessment that nobody was going to act on. I sat there for a while. Then I opened a new log entry, and I started writing, because that is what I do, and because someone should be paying attention, and because the valley below me was quiet and the snow was falling, and somewhere on this damp, noisy, complicated planet, 12 people were already thinking about what they had learned. And one of them was writing it down,